Dr. Jazz.
I saw you are from Bludenz, and I drove through there many times while on tour when going to Switzerland or to Liechtenstein.
Yeah, sure.
And I thought, like, man, you must have an interesting story, you know, because you from there to, I don't know, Paris and New York and Vienna and
yeah, sure. Yeah.
So, but you know, I'll just jump in. How does a guy who lives in Bludenz encounter jazz in the beginning? You know, I guess like mid-70s or when was that? When was the moment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, I was born in Bludenz and then I was raised in Bregenz, which is the capital.
Oh yeah.
In that little small state, most western state of Austria, but there's not a big difference between Bregenz and Bludenz, so it doesn't really matter. And my background, I come from a classical background. My mother was a violin teacher and my dad was a passionate amateur piano player, and their thing was classical music. So we didn't have TV in the 60s and even until the late 70s, but they listened to one piano concerto and one violin concerto every night from. So that was my musical socialization, we say.
Yeah.
You know, so I had a huge input of classical stuff and I hated it. As a kid, of course,
of course,
you have to rebel against the parents and you have to find your own way. And so I had, let me see, when I was 13, I did my first job making some money in the holidays in the summer. And with that money, I bought a big stereo, my own, and a Frank Zappa record.
Oh, wow, cool, okay.
Just Overnight Sensation was the name of that record. And I listened to that one very loud and drove my parents mad. So I had also some friends who played in some rock bands and I always joined. I went there for the rehearsals in some garage and I admired everybody for doing their thing. And at the same time, I was sent to music school to learn classical piano. So that's what I did. And even at the age of 8 years old, I had preferences in my musical taste and I loved Bach. And then I had a big black hole until probably Chopin. All the classical guys, which were the main repertoire of music school that I had to practice, I also didn't like at all. So basically, that's my musical heritage. And then in the 70s, there was a great series of concerts in Bregenz because the responsible person for the cultural program in Bregenz, he was good friends with Manfred Eicher from ECM Records.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, because Manfred Eicher, he's from Lindau. That's only 10 kilometers from Bregenz. And they were good friends. And Eicher started his label in the late 70s. And this other guy, Mr. Sandner, he programmed all the ECM artists in the summer. No, during the whole year in the summer.
Wow.
In a small open air concert area, and in the winter in the Theater am Kornmarkt. And at some point I heard Keith Jarrett playing solo in Bregenz. And since I played classical piano myself. I had no clue what this guy was doing, but I was mesmerized and I couldn't get over it. And the next day I went to the local record store and demanded a record by Keith Jarrett. And he didn't have any. The only one he had was Knu High by Kenny Wheeler.
Mm.
And that one I bought, and it's still one of my favorite records that I have. And that record I listened up and down a zillion times. And so that's where I got hooked to jazz.
Oh,
Long
wow.
story short. And at the same time, we had a very good jazz club in Lustenau, which is also 10 kilometers away from Bregenz. And I started going to the concerts there by the age of 14, I think. And I heard, you know, Dexter Gordon, Dave Liebman, Chet Baker, whatnot. I went there on a bicycle and I had to be back home at 10 o'clock due to my young age. But I always heard the first set and drove back home and had no clue what these guys were doing, except I was totally drawn to it.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's beautiful, man. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be exposed to live music by some of the greatest jazz musicians who were touring in the mid-70s. So,
yeah. How did you then switch all that to bass? And when did you fall into it, like for jazz bass? I mean, jazz improvisation, especially.
Yeah, that's also an interesting part in my biography, because when I was 16, in Bregenz, they installed a new conservatory, not a music school, but conservatory, so one level higher up. And for the first time in the history of Bregenz, there was a teacher for classical bass, acoustic bass, but he had no students, of course. So my piano teacher, who became the new director of that conservatory, he sent all his mediocre students to learn bass, the whole class. So we were like 6 piano students who had to learn bass, so that teacher had students. And I took lessons with Mr. Sorg, was his name. He was a very kind but also very strict teacher, classical background. And he was extremely accurate with the left hand position and just painful. And he was never satisfied with how much I practiced, although I was at, high school full time, and I tried my best, but he was never happy with me. Needless to say, a year and a half into studying with him, I developed tendonitis on my left hand, and it got so bad that I had to quit playing music altogether. And then I got into climbing through some friends, and that became my passion until I was 21 years old, and I became pretty good. The sport climbing philosophy was just starting. It wasn't
hip like now,
fashionable like it is today. It was just starting with, the new slick climbing gear, the shoes and everything. And I was pretty good, and after I finished high school, I didn't know what to do. I just worked in a flower shop, made some money, went climbing for a month, went back to the flower shop. I was just drifting around, as they call it in the States. And when I was 21, I figured out that climbing wasn't really a career for the rest of my life. And my high school specialty was electrical engineering. I didn't want to become an electrical engineer. So music was the only thing that interested me, and it was way too late for classical studies. So I thought jazz might be good, and piano I was way too bad. And I went to Graz for the entrance exam because back then, 1981, that was, Graz was one of the very few university jazz departments in Europe.
Yeah.
So I went there, and for some reason they took me because they had an opening, although I couldn't even play a blues bass line. I got lost in the 10th bar, but Wayne Darling was the teacher back then, and he was just smiling, said, "Yeah, it's okay," you know. So that's how my jazz studies started and everything.
Interesting.
Else. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow. It's like you know, like jazz. Yeah, Graz University now it's completely different now. Like, you know, 30 bass players show up who play like damn well good to be accepted. So it's funny. It's like Berkeley, like in the beginning of the 70s, you know, when like or late 60s, when no one showed up. And but speaking of Berkeley, you know, I saw then you studied there, and how did this move to Boston happen?
Well, you know, I half-heartedly applied for a Fulbright scholarship during my studies in Graz, and I did that in the fourth year of my studies, and I didn't think of it much. And then with the Fulbright, you have to apply, I think, 2 years ahead of time.
Yeah.
And I finished all that, and then I didn't hear anything from them for a year and a half. And all of a sudden, in the spring of, when was it, 86, I think. Yeah. I got a letter in the mail saying they offer me 3 different scholarships or 3 different universities I could study. One was Berkeley, one was NEC. I applied to study with Miroslav Vituš, who was still at NEC at the time, and he was definitely my hero, one of the big heroes. And the other university was North Texas.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Berkeley paid the most, so I decided for Berkeley, and that's how that came about. And at the same time, Wolfgang Muthspiel, he was already in Boston, and we had the first trio, the very first trio with Wolfgang Muthspiel was with me and Alex Deutsch. So I went to Boston 1 year after Wolfgang, and Alex came half a year later. So we all ended up in Boston, and the trio was a very tight-knit thing back then. We rehearsed almost every day, and we did our first record, and it was a very successful trio. And we won a bunch of competitions, and we played in Montreux, and you know, it was all geared for a career.
How was Berkeley like for you? I mean, you know,
during my time, it was really good because I was very fortunate to be in a generation of students that are all, or lots of them are now well known. Let me see. Schoolies Verizon, Jim Black, Chris Speed, Donny McCaslin, Ingrid Jensen, Antonio Hart, Billy Kilson, Rob Sheps, plus 20 other guys.
Yeah, sure, I can imagine,
who are now big names in the scene. We're all in Boston, half of them at NEC and half of them at Berkeley. But at Berkeley, out of the 4,000 students, there were maybe 200 serious students, and out of the 200 were 20 cracks. And so we had a very nice community of playing with each other, and all these names were among them. So, you know, we played in each other's recitals, and it was a very, very alive scene for me. And it was only 2 years, and lots of us graduated around the same time, and lots of us moved to New York all together. The whole Berkeley gang from that year moved to New York, and we just continued doing what we were doing and branching out in New York. And So I was very, very fortunate
Amazing.
with
Like-
my 2 years in Berkeley.
Yeah, like this new, you moved then to New York in 1989, I guess, right?
1989, August 1989.
Wow. How was this move like? I mean, in the beginning, what were the first gigs and your experience when entering that New York scene? I mean,
Yeah, it was, I didn't know many people in New York. I started playing with Aydin Essen in
yeah,
Boston.
I wanted to ask you about him. Yeah,
Yeah, but he still lived in Boston much longer than me. He moved to New York a couple of years later, I think. So when I came to New York, I didn't know many people. I knew my roommates and Ilhan Ershahin and Bana Gierig, who are well-known musicians now as well. But 2 weeks into being in New York, I got a call from Art Farmer.
all right, that's how this happened. Okay, wow.
Yeah, who I played with the summer before in Vienna at the Jazzland for 1 week. And I had told him that I'm going to move to New York. And he said, yeah, give me a call when you're there. So I did. And he called me to play with him at Sweet Basil in October. And Art Farmer was well known for changing his rhythm section with young guys in town every 2 years. So all the jazz musicians showed up at Art's gate just to see who are the new cats in town. So you cannot have a better inauguration as a young jazz player in New York than have the gig with Art Farmer. And I did it for 2 years, and Clifford Jordan was in the band, and Louis Nash was the drummer, and Michael Weise was the first piano player. Geoff Keezer was later.
Yeah,
Marvin Smitty Smith was playing drums. So we played, I think, 2 or 3 times for 2 weeks at Sweet Basil in New York. And it was, fantastic. So everybody knew me pretty quick, or knew that I was in town. And from there on, it was you always had a good reference,
Yeah.
Back then there was no internet. You had your flyers in your pocket, and you went to the gigs, 10 gigs every night, just to say hello and give everybody a flyer. And my reference was, I have the gig with Art Farmer, and everybody, of course, knew who's Art Farmer. So it was fantastic.
Did you quickly start getting gigs? I mean, like then?
Yeah, I started, in New York. There's these sessions, and I remember, I think one of the very first sessions I went to in Brooklyn, to one of those living room sessions. Jamie Baum, a flute player.
Yeah, sure.
She asked me if I want to play a session. I said, yeah, of course. I'm not sure if Jeff Hirschfield was playing drums. Probably,
yeah.
I don't remember. Long story short, we played a session, and after the session, Jamie asked me to put my name in her phone book. She had this thick book next to her phone, and it was organized by instruments, drums, sax, piano. So I said, yeah, great. And I go to the page of the bass players, and I think I was number 87. And two rows up was Eddie Gomez's phone number, and 5 rows up was Dave Holland's phone number.
Oh, man. Okay.
All the big names' phone numbers were there. And I was staring at the list and said to Jamie, why the hell should I put my number there? There's all my heroes. That I was totally blown away. And she said, no, just put your number. It's okay, And I went back home and said, man, this is something else, But she called me again for gigs. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. But that was the first session I did in New York. Also a very good introduction to how things work.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I have a tour in October with Arild Andersen and Bob Moses. We did just a record. And
wow. Okay,
and I saw you did the record. I don't have that one. If you have it, man, if you can send it to me. I saw you did something with Bob and Mordy Ferber, like
Yes.
92 already, like in 93
Yes.
also with Liebman. And how did those records happen? I mean, those are your beginning as a band leader, right?
Yeah, you know, in that period, in the early 90s, I started doing theater soundtracks for a close friend of mine in Vienna. And it was a kind of an avant-garde theater group. And they commissioned soundtracks for their productions. And I did, I think, 10 different ones. And the one with Bob and Mordy Ferber, that was a theater piece called Nathan der Weise by Lessing, very famous
yeah, sure, I know. Yeah.
German piece. So there's a CD with that. And the other one with Liebman, that's a soundtrack for King Oedipus. That's a multi-track bass CD plus Dave Liebman playing on top of it. And I have both of them. I can send them both to you.
Oh man, please, that's so much love to hear that.
Just you give me your mailing address. I'll put it
please.
in there. Yeah.
And this was on your own label? I mean, what was...
Yeah, I started, you know, I started a small label, Aziza Music it was called. All that we're talking about pre-internet.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That was now it's easy, you know. Now it's Bandcamp, and you do it basically. And how was it back then?
Yeah. Back then, you know, everybody, not everybody, but lots of people started their own record labels, and because to get a record deal even back then wasn't that easy.
Sure.
And especially if you did adventurous music, it didn't get easier with that one. So everybody started a label, so did I, and that's how that happened. And it was a one-man band, basically. I did the production, I financed everything, I put everything out, I sent it to journalists, so hopeless. Yeah. Nevertheless, very nice productions I did, and yeah, it was just a thing to do back then. Now, as you said, things have changed so rapidly.
Yeah.
It still exists as Aziza Music, but I haven't put anything out in a while.
Yeah. Did you, with these groups, you know, that we mentioned, did you also play with them in New York as a band leader, or?
Bob Moses, he called me a couple of times for rehearsals with his band in New York. I never played live with him. Dave Liebman, I played with over the last decades, probably not many times, but a few times. He was very good friends with Wolfgang Reisinger, the drummer.
Yeah, sadly.
They played a lot. Wolfgang Reisinger just passed away.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
That's sad.
So, yeah, it's very sad. And through that connection, I encountered Dave Liebman very early on. And, yeah, so.
You know, me being a guitarist, I saw you played with John Abercrombie for quite some time. And, you know, how was John like? You know, I love Marc Copland also. And, you know, it was Billy Hart I read on drums. I mean, you cannot imagine really a better band. Like, how did this story with that crew happen? And how was especially, I mean, John, like your experience with him?
Oh, it was wonderful. I met Marc Copland in the early 90s, I think, for the first time. And I forgot the context. I have to ask him how we met. I don't remember. But he always had this quartet with Marc and Billy Hart. And I think True Grass was and then Drew couldn't make a tour in the West. I think it was a string of 4 concerts or something, and 4 or 6 concerts. So in San Francisco, in San Jose, in Walla Walla, Washington, and Seattle, and place like that. And Marc called me if I could sub for Drew. So I did, and both Billy Hart and John were sweethearts with me. I mean, there was no vibe, there was nothing, none being on the same level, on a human level and music level. They treated me like one of them, which was fantastic to see. And that's my experience with the biggest names. They're the sweetest cats.
Yeah.
You know, the lesser known musicians, sometimes they have a little attitude or, you know.
Yeah.
But the big guys, they're sweethearts altogether.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, and then, you know, I guess I sounded okay in that first tour, and they called me again. We did some gigs in Europe, and then Marc called me of 3 or 4 times to do trio tours with him and Jochen Rückert.
Oh, wow, beautiful. Yeah.
And we toured extensively in Europe, and we kept in touch. And as a matter of fact, I'm planning to do a record with Marc, playing standards.
Oh man, beautiful.
Yeah, we're gonna do that in the fall. And
fantastic.
Because I have never done a record just playing standards. And
yeah.
If I could not think of a better piano player to do that with than Marc Copland.
Yeah, he's so beautiful. I mean, he's playing this, like the last solo record he did on Abercrombie's music. And that's amazing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So nice. Well, you know, I have that record, Bach Chromatic Universe, by you, and you know, I really love that one. And you know, you mentioned Bach before, and how did you decide to do that one? I think that must have been quite a big one. You know, when I see the people, the lineup, and the music you wrote is so beautiful. Like, how did that one begin?
That one, I think I heard a radio show about the motif BACH, and there was a classical piano player, Michael Arischke, I think was his name. I'm not sure, but he put out a CD where he plays piano works from the classical world dealing with BACH, because a lot of composers wrote pieces using that motif. And I just said to myself, man, what a brilliant idea, you know. And nobody ever did something like that in the jazz world. And I said, yeah, Bach is my hero anyway. Still is, by the way. And why not attempt to do something with that little motif? And that record started to function in my brain. And, you know, the people that I called for that record, I think was a good choice.
Yeah. I love you and Kenny. I mean, you know.
Kenny. Yeah, Kenny is another sweetheart. That very underrated, fantastic drummer.
Yeah. And he's really busy. I mean, you know, with Frizzell and everyone, like.
I know. Now he's great. Yeah, very deservedly.
So. Yeah, he's so creative. I wanted to ask you about one bizarre one in your discography. I mean, maybe not bizarre, but like Paul Simon.
Yeah, Paul Simon.
How did that one? I mean, I know you were in New York, I guess, you know, so it's kind of all intertwined, but still.
Yeah, I mean, that one happened through Steve Sheehan, who is a percussionist in Paris, and he was very good friends with Jamie Haddad, who I knew from New York.
Yeah.
So Jamie, I did this other record, Joseph Kopf poems, and Jamie Haddad is on that one. And that's with Theo Blackman and Skoulis Veroson.
Oh man, I have to find that. Okay.
Yeah. And one actor reading the poems, and 2 bassists, me and Skouli. And at that time, Steve Sheehan was on holidays in New York, and he stayed with Jamie Haddad at the recording date. And Jamie called me the evening before and said, yeah, I have this great friend from Paris in town. would you mind if I bring him to the recording session? And I said, no, great. So Steve came to the recording session, and I said, man, you are here. Why don't you play with us? So we did the CD, the whole thing with him, without rehearsal or whatnot. So he's on that record. And then Steve called me to play with his projects. He has, for a long time, he played with Tuaregs from southern Algeria, so North African music, gorgeous stuff. So I played in his projects. So we became good friends. And then Jamie Haddad started playing with Paul Simon. And he also got Steve Sheehan on the gig with Paul Simon. And at some point, I think it was 2001, I was invited to Essaouira, to a newly installed Gnawa festival where they had Gnawa bands perform, and they invited 3 or 4 Western musicians to play with these Gnawa musicians. So I was one of the featured soloists with a Gnawa band. And Paul Simon happened to be on vacation during that period, and he attended the concert, and we were all hanging out. Jamie, Steve Sheehan, me, Paul Simon, and some other people. And we met a few times in Essaouira, and we talked and talked and talked. And Paul Simon was just in the middle of finishing that record. And during the concert, I played an arco solo on top of the Gnawa stuff, and he really loved that. And he said, you know, Peter, I think I'm going to call you to play on my new CD. And I said, yeah, sure. So sure enough, 2 weeks later, I wasn't back in New York, and the phone rings, and who's on the phone? Paul Simon himself. I said, yeah, Peter, do you have time next week, Wednesday, 2 to 6, Power Station Studio? So I went there, and he had 2 songs in mind to have me play on top, and one was one song I did multi-track.
Quiet, and You're the One, right?
Yeah, exactly. One thing I did arco tremolo chordal structure on top of what is in there, and the other one is the quiet one. He wanted me to play solo, and he had very specific ideas of what he wanted from me, and I think we did 4 or 5 takes. None of them he really liked, and at some point he said, you know what, Peter, just do what you think is right. And I did one more take, my rendition of what I would have done, and that's the one that's on the record.
Oh, wow, interesting. Yeah, I've heard he's quite specific, you know, like many guys who recorded in his studio recordings were like, I want this exactly there, and like, interesting. Yeah.
So that's how that happened. But I never played that with him. I'm just on that record, and of course, it's a beautiful detail. And
but still, an interesting, you know, touch in your musical.
Absolutely, yeah. And once again, Paul Simon is also a sweetheart. Whatever people have to say about him, he's the sweetest person you can imagine.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you mentioned Paris now a couple of times, and why did you move out of New York to Paris, and how was that decision based on? I mean, why out of New York, basically?
Yeah, you know, I lived in New York for 14 years.
Yeah, it's a long one.
And the rat race is always the same in New York, and you're just running around 24/7 trying to make a buck to pay the rent on the first. Nothing had changed for me with that aspect of life. And then 9/11 happened in 2001.
Oh shit, yeah, exactly.
And I was there. I lived on the Lower East Side. I could directly see from my top fifth floor apartment. I could directly see the towers, and from my roof I could see it. And I mean, the whole thing was such a shock for everybody. And the year after 9/11 was kind of muted, and I would say depressed, but very much the steam was taken out of everybody's doing in a way. And also, more than half of my best friends moved out of New York immediately, like the 2 months afterwards. Everybody, a lot of best friends had left, and it was for me a time to, I never wanted to get old in New York. You know, if you plan to do that, you need a lot of money. You know? So there's no way to retire in New York, and I never felt I could feel as a New Yorker. Definitely, I love New York, but American, I was never so close, and I always felt European, and so I wanted to move back to Europe. And okay, where do you go after such a long time in New York? My list of towns in Europe was very short. It was Berlin, London, and Paris. And I did want to learn another language. Berlin in the winter is very gray and cold, and German I know already. And London is a great town for musicians, but very difficult to get around, and almost impossible to find a decent apartment where you don't have to commute 2 hours to get from A to B. And English I knew already. And Paris, a friend of mine had this apartment that she offered me to start with, to live in. And at the same time, I started playing with Marcel Khalifa, this fantastic oud player and singer from Beirut, and he lived in Paris. So all that combined
made sense.
Made my decision to move to Paris in 2003 very logical and natural to me.
Europe, and you mentioning London, I have you on a Phil Robson record and a Huw Warren record. So I'm quite curious, you know, since you moved basically to Paris, but you seem to connect with the British scene, with the London scene, with these incredible players. And how did that connection begin then?
I don't know which one happened first, but for sure, Christine Tobin was the, I think, I'm not sure if I have the right order, timeline order in my brain, but I think I invited her to be a juror in a competition for young rock bands in Western Austria, in Vorarlberg, where I'm from. They asked me to be the head of a jury to judge young upcoming bands, and so I asked Christine to be part of that team. And ever since, she invited me then to play with her band in London. And you know, back then, Paris, London, we had the TGV, and it took only 2 hours, 15 minutes to go to London. So it was very quick and very easy. And then in London, playing with Christine, also I'm on 1 or 2 records of hers. Her boyfriend was Phil Robson. So I met him. We have a good thing going. And he invited me for his record. And playing in London, there was this one club where everybody mingled, which is the Vortex. The whole contemporary jazz scene is at the Vortex. So that's where I met Huw Warren, and we hooked up. I think Christine, she was good friends with Oliver Windling, the guy from Baby Records. And Christine hooked up a solo concert for me at the Vortex, and Oliver was also involved with programming the Vortex, and I think it was a little bit too iffy for them Peter Herbert solo for a whole evening. So they added one half as a duo with Huw Warren. So he came in from Cardiff, and we played a duo set, and it just clicked immediately. And ever since, I've been playing with Huw, and so one thing gave the other. And and I had a little in Paris, just around the corner from my apartment. There was the Set Les Arts, which was a small, also like a living room playing situation with a very nice owner, Caroline, and she was a fan of adventurous music, and I became good friends with her, and she gave me a series of, what was it, Mondays in August or Mondays in blah, blah, blah. So I had a steady gig at the Set Les Arts for weeks and weeks, and I invited all the London cats to come to Paris. There was no money, but a great hang.
Sure.
And
beautiful.
Huw was there, Mr. Siegel was there, I think Phil and Christine, they might have been there. So, there was a very easy connection to London, between Paris and London. Now, it's not possible anymore. You need a visa to go to London.
Yeah.
And, the money situation for everybody, especially, I think in Great Britain in general, the public subsidies have been shortened. Yeah. So they are back to playing with their own guys, which are great, of course.
Yeah, sure.
Fantastic musicians in Great Britain, but that interchange between the international interchange has somehow stopped. It's not the same that it used to be. And then, of course, COVID did the rest. Now, I must say, for me personally, most of the international traveling has pretty much stopped. I don't know if it's ever going to come back, but it's definitely not the same that it used to be.
Yeah. I mean, I hope it returns slowly, at least in Europe, that we get the gigs going on, and
Of course, yeah.
But I mentioned Phil Robson, and you also have an interesting story, like a lot of duos with guitarists, like David Tronzo, an incredibly underrated player, and Noël Axiotet. You did something recently, actually, and but especially with David. How did your story with David begin and playing, with him?
David, I met in New York, and he also lived in the East Village, just 1.5 blocks away from me. And I met him through a saxophone player named David Castiglione, who was kind of he was a social person, everybody knew David. He also worked as a bartender in a bar, so his social skills were incredibly good. And he hooked up a gig with me and David Tronzo, Midtown. No, not Midtown. It was on 14th Street. I forgot the name of the club. Nothing big or famous. But we met and we improvised more or less, or played simple tunes. And there's David Tronzo, this incredible slide guitar player that I had never heard of. And man, he blew me away, And so we started becoming really good friends and started playing duos. I invited him to Austria for the record you have for
Segmente,
Segmente, that's a compilation of 2 duo concerts we did in Austria. And ever since, I kept inviting him for touring, workshops, etc., etc. And a few years ago, he invited me to Berkeley to do a workshop in his guitar class. So, the friendship has lasted, and yeah, it's a very beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's nice. It's the you know, you have so many duos, and you know, you said you're thinking about something with Marc Copland. I think that's a nice thing. But I wanted to ask you, you know, I know COVID kind of, you know, stopped many things, but you as a band leader, what are your where are your next thoughts going, especially jazz wise or improvisation wise? Are you thinking about a new project or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as you said, I love the small ensembles or duos, and trios are probably my favorite setups. One reason being is that I have been searching in the extended techniques area for 2 decades now, and those sounds are very soft, some of them, and you cannot really use them in a band context as much as I would like to use them. But in a duo context, you can use them a lot. So that's why sorry, drummers, but I don't really play so much with drummers because of that reason. You know, it's just a total different dynamic and sound aesthetic doing these extended techniques, and that's why I prefer the duos. And I have a record coming out with Josef Novotny. He's also a piano player, electronic musician in Vienna. That's coming out in October on Collegno. Then the duo with Marc. Then I'm preparing to put out a solo record with similar to the Naked Bass that I have put out, but this time with videos, so everybody can watch me producing those sounds.
Oh, fantastic!
How they are made, and so those are the next projects. In terms of jazz, nothing particular. I mean, tomorrow I play at Porgy and Bess and with Karl Ratzer, and we record a CD there. You know,
that's gotta be fun. Come on.
Karl Ratzer. You know,
one of the old Graz connections. Sure.
Yeah. That's so. Nice. So I'm part, as a sideman, I'm part of many projects. There's also a great band by Georg Greve, the Sonic Fiction.
Yeah, I saw that you did an album like 2 years ago or something. I love Georg's writing, man. He's incredible.
It's something. So, you know, I'm involved in band projects, but I'm not really. I do have a finished quintet album. It's called the Scruffy Herberts, with 2 different setups, one European part and one New York part. And that's with my nephew Kenji, who's a guitar player, and he just moved back to Vienna after 10 years in Brooklyn. And he also started with David Tronzo at Berkeley and with Mick Burke. So he is So,
man, come on, put it out. Let's hear it.
I'm 62 now, and I plan to put out a 5 CD set when I'm 65 for, you know, the next period in my life. You retire from your university job, and a new chapter will be open. So for that one, I prepare a 5 CD issue of all kinds of stuff.
Right. Super, Peter. I won't disturb you anymore.
You're not disturbing at all.
You know, thanks for sharing some of these thoughts and you know, a little surfing through your musical life. So that's beautiful to hear that. So
So and you, are you touring now, or are you?
Well, I have this tour in October. We have like 14 concerts in 15 days with Arild and Bob. I'm so much looking forward to that. It's gonna be like a university for me. So,
Are you gonna be in Vienna?
Yeah, we play in Porgy on, I don't know exactly the date, but it's like mid-October. I'll drop you a line and
please please do. If I'm here, I'll certainly stop by. Man, I haven't seen Bob in ages.
Thank you.